The young bride, Luara, had to live with her in-laws for a while, but she had no idea that these elderly people were hiding a terrible secret and that they would turn her life into a true nightmare. Luara led a life that many young women her age dreamed of having. She and Tony had married just a few months ago, and everything seemed like a fairy tale. The couple had decided to live temporarily with Tony's family while they planned to buy their own house. The place was spacious, offering enough room for everyone, and Luara felt very comfortable there. By getting married, in addition to gaining a loving husband, she was warmly welcomed by her in-laws, Mr. Taran and Mrs. Dahia, two very kind elderly people who had always treated her with affection. Life in their company was more than pleasant, almost perfect. Every day Mr. Taran made a point of asking his daughter-in-law how her day had been, if she was adjusting well to her new life as a married woman, or if she needed anything, always very attentive. A recurring topic during family gatherings, and sometimes around the dinner table, was the love story of the two elders. Tony would proudly tell how his parents had met in a small African village many years ago. Every time he mentioned this, his eyes would light up as if he was reliving every detail of the stories he had heard many times growing up. According to him, his mother, Mrs. Dahia, came from a very modest family with very few resources, while his father, a young man full of ambition and courage, appeared in her life like a true saviour. This story, often repeated by Tony, added a touch of romance and admiration to his family's past. Besides her husband, Luara also listened to her father-in-law recount all the details with great pride several times. But beyond these inspiring words, there was something that Luara couldn't ignore, the expression of Mrs. Dyer every time Taran or her husband narrated the past. She remained silent, slightly nodding her head in approval. To others, this might seem like a simple gesture of discretion, letting the men speak, but Luara noticed something more in this woman's eyes. There was a deep sadness, the reflection of something that couldn't be expressed in words. It was as if each nod was a confirmation, not only of the story but also of an old pain, a burden she had silently carried for many years. It was something very subtle, almost imperceptible. For those who weren't paying attention, the first time the young woman became certain of her suspicions was during a family dinner. As usual, Tony had begun telling the story of his parents, as he always did, recounting the bravery of Mr. Taran when he saved his mother from poverty. Mrs. Dahia remained silent, and Luara, who already had doubts, started observing every gesture of her mother-in-law and every expression she tried to hide. It was at that moment that she noticed Mrs. Dahia's hand, resting on the table, was trembling slightly when Taran mentioned the day he took her out of the village. This small momentary sign of weakness spoke more than 1,000 words could. It was as if, for a brief instant, the mask of serenity that Mrs. Dahia wore had cracked, revealing a hidden pain. What had really happened in that village? Why did Dahia seem so sad when remembering the past while Taran was so proud? Luara wondered. One day during breakfast, while they were preparing some homemade bread together, Luara tried to touch on topics that might reveal something about Dahia's past. She spoke about the village, about what life must have been like there, but every time the conversation approached something more personal, Dahia would smile, change the subject, ask Luara about her plans with Tony, or simply start talking about the day's chores as if she hadn't heard the question. The days passed in that immense house, and Luara wondered if she was exaggerating or if her curiosity was going too far. As she continued to insist on discussing the past, Dahia began to distance herself and avoid being in her presence. A month later, things started to get complicated for Luara and Tony. The dream of living together and building a life faced challenges they hadn't anticipated. Bills piled up, and the money they had was no longer enough to cover all the expenses. Tony, concerned about ensuring a better future for the two of them, knew he had to do something. After many late-night conversations and calculations that never seemed to make sense, Tony made a difficult decision. He had found a job opportunity in another city, a job that paid much better than anything he could find in the area where they lived. However, accepting this offer came with a heavy burden because he would have to be away from his wife for a while. They had been married for only a short time, and the thought of leaving his wife behind, even temporarily, was painful. But unfortunately, there was no other choice. It was the necessary sacrifice for them to overcome this phase and have a better life. After everything was prepared, Tony left with great sadness, while Luara stayed behind, watching her husband's car disappear into the distance. The house had become silent without Tony. Luara once enjoyed the company of her in-laws, but after noticing the sadness in Mrs. Dahia's eyes and the way she avoided talking about the past, Luara could no longer feel comfortable. To make matters worse, the young woman had nowhere to go, as her family lived far away in a remote village, and the journey to visit them was not simple. Luara tried to convince herself that she was simply being paranoid, but her unease did not diminish. On the contrary, it grew. A week had passed since Tony's departure, and his absence weighed more heavily on Luara than she had imagined. Gradually, she began to notice subtle changes in Taryn's behaviour. He, who had always been attentive and considerate, now seemed to be constantly near her, watching her in a way that made her uncomfortable. At first, she tried to ignore it, convincing herself that it was just loneliness speaking. But that didn't work. Taryn was now constantly observing her, appearing like a ghost when she least expected it, standing still, simply watching her. He followed her with his eyes throughout the house. There were moments when she was in the kitchen, distracted, doing the dishes or preparing something, and when she turned around, she would see her father-in-law standing there, watching her in a way that made her heart race. Mr. Taryn also began to give her small gifts for no apparent reason, and what once might have seemed like a gesture of affection now took on a different tone, almost possessive. Despite her growing unease, she tried not to think too much about it, telling herself she was exaggerating and that it was just Taryn's way of making her feel less lonely in her husband's absence. After a tiring day, Luara decided to go to bed earlier, leaving her in-laws in the dining room. "Everything okay, my dear?" asked Mrs. Dahia, concerned. "Yes, just a little tired," Luara replied, "and I think I need a good night's sleep." Entering the bedroom, Luara carefully closed the door, as if that could somehow protect her from the thoughts that haunted her. She let herself fall onto the bed, hoping the comfort of the sheets could calm the storm in her mind, but her thoughts continued to swirl. Why was Taryn looking at her that way? Was she imagining things? The night was silent, and sleep wouldn't come. She turned over in bed once more, desperately trying to calm her mind and finally find some rest. But just as sleep began to take over, Luara heard a noise that made her freeze. If you like today's story, don't forget to leave a like on the video. And if you haven't subscribed yet, click the subscribe button below so you don't miss any updates. The door handle of the bedroom turned slowly, producing a slight click as the door began to open almost in slow motion. Luara remained paralyzed, trying to control her breathing, pretending to be asleep. Her half-closed eyes observed the presence in the doorway. The shadow cast into the darkness of the room overwhelmed her with terror, and the only sound she could hear now was that of her own heart beating fast and hard against her chest. It was Mr. Taryn, standing like an oppressive shadow. He didn't say anything or move more than necessary to open the door. He remained still, merely watching her as if trying to decide what to do. Luara's mind raced, desperately trying to understand what he was doing there and what he wanted from her. Why was he looking at her that way? Dark thoughts filled her mind, but she didn't dare move, fearing that any movement might trigger something she wasn't ready to face. The minutes seemed to stretch into hours, and she could feel Taryn's gaze burning in her direction, even without seeing him clearly. The man did not approach or say a word, but the intensity of the moment was unbearable. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, she heard the sound of footsteps lightly moving on the floor. Taryn had left the room, closing the door with the same slowness with which he had opened it. The sense of relief was almost overwhelming, but it was mixed with a paralyzing fear. Even after he left, Luara remained lying still, trying to understand what had just happened. She couldn't sleep for the rest of the night. Every noise in the house made her even more nervous. The next morning, Luara had barely slept. The pale face reflected in the mirror showed the signs of a sleepless night, tormented by what had happened. She got up early, much earlier than usual, hoping to avoid any encounter with Mr. Taryn. She needed a strong cup of coffee, something to help her keep her composure. But as soon as she entered the kitchen, the shock of reality hit her full force. Mr. Taryn was sitting at the table as if waiting for her. Good morning, dear Luara," he said in such a casual voice that she doubted what had happened the night before. What had happened the previous night. "And you woke up early today," he added. She froze for a moment, trying to respond without betraying the whirlwind of emotions boiling inside her. "Good morning," she replied, forcing a smile. "Yes, I thought it would be nice to take advantage of the morning." As she walked toward the cupboard to grab a cup, she felt his eyes fixed on her back. Every movement she made seemed to be observed, and the tension in her shoulders only grew. She tried to stay calm, but her father-in-law's presence made her nervous. "And did you sleep well?" he asked. Luara had to pause and take a breath before answering. "Yes." "Good," he replied, slowly getting up from the table and approaching her. "It's important to get good rest, especially when you're alone." With her coffee in hand, Luara quickly found an excuse to leave Taryn's presence. When Tony finally returned from his trip, Luara felt an immense weight lift off her shoulders. As soon as she saw him walk through the door, she ran to embrace him, finally feeling a sense of security. For the first time in days, she was able to breathe, convinced that with Tony by her side, nothing bad could happen. That night, Luara tried to gather the courage to talk about what had happened during his absence. She knew she had to tell Tony about her father-in-law's strange behavior, how he had watched her at night, and the discomfort she felt in his presence. But at the same time, she was afraid of his reaction. After much hesitation, she finally decided to speak. "Tony, I need to tell you something." He was getting ready for bed, but turned to her with curiosity. "You seem worried," he said. Luara then began to describe her father-in-law's behavior, saying that it made her uncomfortable. Tony frowned, but instead of the alarmed reaction Luara was expecting, he just smiled and shook his head as if it were a minor concern. "My love, you must have scared yourself for nothing. My father has always been super protective. He must have just been checking to see if you were okay. There's nothing to worry about." "Do you really think so?" she asked, trying to hide the disappointment in her voice. "I'm sure," Tony replied confidently. "He was just trying to take care of you while I was away. You know how he is, always worried about the family. I don't think there's any reason to be alarmed." Although Luara didn't fully believe her husband's explanation, they spent the week enjoying each other's company, and as long as Tony was home, she felt at ease. But the dreaded day finally arrived. Tony had to leave again for work. The mere thought of it, the room, the thought of being alone in this house overwhelmed her with sadness and anxiety. As Tony packed his things, Luara watched in silence, trying to find the right words, but all she felt was a lump in her throat that prevented her from speaking. When he finally closed his suitcase, she couldn't hold back the tears any longer. "Tony, please don't go. I don't know if I can stay here alone again," Luara implored, her voice trembling. "I'm scared to stay without you." "I know it's hard, my love," Tony said, trying to comfort her, "but it's just for a little while longer. I need to work to secure our future, you know that." "I know, but something tells me it's not safe here. Please stay a little longer, don't leave me alone again," she pleaded. Tony gently took her face in his hands, wiping away the tears that streamed down. "I promise you, everything will be fine. My mother and father are here, and I trust them to take care of you. I know it's difficult, but trust me. "I'll be back before you know it," Tony reassured her, though she remained worried. Luara begged her husband to take her with him, but Tony explained that he couldn't because the place wasn't suitable. Their farewell was long and painful, and when they finally parted, Luara felt a void forming within her, a hole that seemed to swallow all the courage she had tried to muster. Watching Tony leave, Luara had no choice but to resign herself to this new reality. She would be alone in the house again with her in-laws. Since Tony's departure, the fear that had haunted her only grew stronger. The image of Mr. Taryn standing at her bedroom door, watching her in the dark, wouldn't leave her mind. She knew she had to take steps to protect herself. So that night, before going to bed, she firmly locked her bedroom door, as if this simple act could create a barrier between her and her fears. Turning the key in the lock gave her a slight wave of relief. She would finally have some peace without worrying about someone entering her space while she slept. With this false sense of security, she eventually fell asleep, her body finally giving in to the accumulated fatigue. But the tranquility that Luara thought she had achieved didn't last long. In the middle of the night, around 3 a.m., as she slept deeply, Mr. Taryn approached her room. He knew the door would be locked, but having a copy of the key gave him the confidence to continue. He slowly opened the door, careful not to make a sound, and entered. Into the room, silent as a shadow. Luara slept deeply, completely unaware that the man she feared was now in her bedroom. Taryn moved with caution, each step calculated to avoid waking her. As he watched, Luara stirred slightly in her bed, perhaps instinctively sensing that something was wrong, but not enough to wake up. Taryn remained still, his eyes fixed on the young woman's sleeping form, who was nearly undressed. The room was engulfed in absolute silence. Taryn closed the door and moved even closer to her. When she finally sensed someone's presence beside her, she woke up with a start and found herself face to face with her father-in-law standing next to her bed. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice trembling as she tried to cover herself with a sheet. But before she could do anything else, Mr. Taryn lunged on top of her, covering her mouth to prevent her from screaming. Taryn began to stroke her hair and skin with a gentleness that was horribly out of place. "You are a very special woman," he murmured in a disturbing voice. "My son is very lucky to have you as his wife." Luara tried with all her strength to break free, but despite his age, the man seemed stronger than her, and she couldn't escape his grasp. After several minutes of struggle, exhausted, she no longer had the strength to resist, and Taryn completely overpowered her, forcing her to lie down with him. When he was finally done, drained and desperate, Luara clung to her pillow and cried uncontrollably as she watched Taryn leave her room. It was then that she saw something even more terrifying. Her mother-in-law, Madame Dahia, had been watching the entire time from the doorway without doing anything. Luara couldn't believe what she was seeing, and to make her pain even worse, she was completely alone in that house. The next morning, as the first rays of sunlight began to filter through the window, Luara finally found the strength to get up. Her body was still trembling with fear and anguish, but she couldn't stay another second in that house. The terror she had felt the night before, Taryn's words and his touch, she would never be able to forget them. Barefoot, she quickly got out of bed, heading for the door as silently and quickly as possible. Near the exit, she heard voices, an animated discussion between her in-laws. Curious but terrified, Luara discreetly approached the top of the stairs, trying to understand what was happening. Dahia's words were filled with anger and pain. "I will never forgive you for this. How could you do this to me, taking me away from my parents when I was just a child? I know very well what you are capable of. My parents didn't want this. You and your smuggler men took me away. You forced me when I was still a child, a pain I will never forget. And now you've repeated your cowardice with your own daughter-in-law." In the course of the conversation, Dahia revealed that Mr. Taryn was a criminal who kidnapped women and children from poor African villages. His group would either sell the women or children to brothels or take for themselves whatever they liked. You have destroyed everything. I will hate you forever. Daya's voice was filled with despair, and Luara could feel it from afar. Now everything made sense. It was never just her imagination. Near the front door, she struggled to breathe. Daya, the woman who had always seemed so calm and reserved, was hiding a terrible secret. The secret that kept her trapped in that house with a man Luara now knew was capable of atrocities. Unimaginable, and worst of all, Tarin had turned her life into a nightmare. He had ruined Daya's life, and now he was about to do the same with hers. Luara could have stayed there to hear more, but she had to leave immediately. She started to descend the stairs, praying that no one would hear her. Her mind was a whirlwind of thoughts. She remembered her husband, the good times they had shared together. When she finally reached the front door, her hands were trembling uncontrollably as she tried to turn the handle, but the door wouldn't budge. It was locked. A greater panic began to rise within her as she realized it wasn't as simple as she had hoped. The exit she thought she had was blocked. No, 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 Luara murmured to herself, tears streaming down her face as she struggled to open the door. She pulled with all her might, but it was useless. She was trapped. Growing more desperate, Luara ran through the house, trying every window, but they were all locked. There was no way out. "Please open it! Please let me out!" she repeated as she tried to turn the handle of the kitchen door. As she fought to find an escape from her worst nightmare, a deep voice echoed in the background. "Where do you think you're going?" Luara turned around in terror and saw Tarin standing there, arms crossed and a terrifying smile on his face. Her eyes widened, her hands trembling with panic as she tried to flee, while Tarin slowly approached her. "Please, please, leave me alone," Luara cried. Tarin reached out, his fingers brushing against Luara's hair. "There's nothing to be afraid of," he said. "You are so beautiful, so perfect. And now, tell me in the comments what you think the terrible Tarin will do to Luara. Let's reach the goal of 100 comments on this video so I can bring you part 2, which is simply unmissable.